Okay, so something did go wrong with the recording this morning, so I apologize for getting this up a little late. But this is going to be the final lecture of the semester. We're talking about chapter 20 today, the ecosystems. So last lecture in chapter 19, we talked about populations and communities. So we're kind of backing up to look at even bigger picture things, the ecosystem. So even though this is the last chapter of new material, we still have a few assignments left, so make sure you're getting all of those quizzes, homework assignments, labs submitted. That research paper due date is coming up, and then we'll have a final quiz on Monday, May 11th, and then that'll be it. So definitely keep an eye on all those due dates and make sure you're getting all of those turned in. So, an ecosystem, on Monday we talked about communities, which were all of these interacting populations of organisms. So now we're taking those communities, those biotic communities, and we're adding in abiotic components, so non-living components. And this is all still in a specific area. So all of the communities and then all of these things like temperature, precipitation, geology, the type of habitat that's in an area, those are going to be our abiotic factors. Ecosystems can be small. So in this figure down here, this tide pool, that itself is an ecosystem, even though it's very small. We can also have very large ecosystems like these rainforests here. So size does not make an ecosystem, but we're just thinking about all of those biotic and abiotic components interacting with each other. So on the planet, we have a few different types of ecosystems. We have freshwater ecosystems. These are our least common ecosystems. They only take up about 1.8% of the Earth's surface. Things like lakes, rivers, streams, those are going to be our freshwater ecosystems. Marine ecosystems, on the other hand, are the most common type of ecosystem. If you think about just what the planet looks like, most of it's covered with water, and that water is mostly oceans. So the marine ecosystems cover about 75% of the Earth's surface. This can be shallow water ecosystems like coral reefs, deep ocean water, the ocean floor in the deep ocean areas. All of those factor into those marine ecosystems. And then we also have terrestrial ecosystems. This is the ones that we're probably most familiar with. They are grouped into large categories called biomes. So even though we have, so basically we have certain types of ecosystems that might exist in multiple places on the planet. We might have a pine forest in North America and a pine forest in Europe. So those are both going to be in the same biome. These biomes are based on the main plant type. So what kinds of plants do they have there? And the climate conditions that they have. So the temperature and the precipitation in that area. These can be things like rainforests, savannas, deserts, grasslands, pine forests, deciduous forests. Those are all going to be our biomes, our terrestrial ecosystems. This is a summary of all of those terrestrial biomes. I am not going to go into detail about each of these biomes since you guys have picked one or are going to pick one for your research paper. That does not mean they won't be in the quiz. They definitely can be. So make sure you take a look at your textbook and read the descriptions of those terrestrial biomes, but this is a great summary. So you can look down here on the x-axis, we have average temperature with hot temperatures over here and low temperatures over here. And then on our y-axis, we have our precipitation. So if we have hot areas that don't get a lot of rain, that's our desert. If we have cold areas that don't get a lot of rain, that's our tundra. But then if we go up here to the other side, we have a lot of rain and warm temperatures. Those are going to be our tropical rainforests. The other ones kind of fit in between those three extremes. So again, make sure you take a look at the textbook because it could pop up in the quiz, sort of questions about the plant types and the climate conditions in different biomes, even though we're not discussing them in detail right now. So ecosystems are routinely exposed to different types of disturbances. When we talk about a disturbance, this is just a change in the environment that can affect their composition. So this could be a yearly variation, that could be a disturbance. Maybe there's a lot of difference between the winter temperatures and the summer temperatures. maybe there's a wet season and a dry season. That can all affect the composition of ecosystems. So if you haven't listened to the last lecture, make sure you do, because we do talk about sort of how communities change in response to disturbances in regards to ecological succession. So make sure you take a look at those slides and listen to that part of the lecture. When we think about an ecosystem, if we are interested in its response to a disturbance, what we want to understand is a state of equilibrium. So the constant maintenance of the biodiversity in that ecosystem. So its ability to stay right there and then how quickly it can recover to there, that's going to be really important for us to understand. So with this equilibrium, it's possible that the number of species and the occurrence of these species might change, but our biodiversity is going to be somewhat constant in this equilibrium state. If our ecosystem is able to stay at an equilibrium despite disturbances and changes, that's its resistance. If we have an ecosystem that is exposed to a disturbance, but then is able to recover after being disturbed, that's its resilience. So resistance and resilience of an ecosystem are important for us to understand. These are especially important when we're thinking about how humans might be impacting the environment. What are we doing to the environment, and how is this ecosystem responding? Is it able to resist change? Is it able to respond to these changes? What is that ecosystem doing? When we think about our ecosystems, there are two main processes that sustain them. One is energy flow, and the second is chemical cycling. So we're going to talk about energy flow first, and then we will finish up the lecture talking about chemical cycling. When we think about energy flow, this is the passage of energy through different components of the ecosystem. Energy here referring to the feeding relationship, so how food is moving in the ecosystem there. And then chemical cycling is this recycling, this use and reuse of certain elements in an ecosystem. So that's what we'll talk about towards the end of the lecture. Energy flow is dependent on the transfer of substances in these feeding relationships. So these feeding relationships are referred to as the trophic structure of an ecosystem. Anytime you see that word troph, you're thinking of feeding. Remember our heterotrophs and our autotrophs. Our autotrophs are our self feeders. Heterotrophs have to feed on something else in order to get their energy. So that troph word always referring to some sort of feeding something. So within our trophic structure, each organism is going to occupy a certain trophic level or an energy level in this food chain, in this trophic structure. A food chain is just a linear sequence of organisms through which energy passes. So this is a simple demonstration of a trophic structure in an ecosystem. And we're going to break this down and kind of look at each level. It's going to be important that you understand where organisms fit in these food chains. At the bottom of our food chain, we have our primary producers. These are the foundation of the food chain. These are our photosynthetic organisms, our autotrophs. You can't be at the bottom of the food chain unless you are able to produce your own food. If you are eating something else, then by definition, you can't be at the bottom of the food chain. Okay, so producers are going to be down at the bottom. Right above that, we have our primary consumer. So we're no longer a producer anymore. We are a consumer now, but we are the primary consumer because we are consuming the producers. So these are our herbivores, our plant eaters, primary consumers eating those primary producers. Above our primary consumers, we have our secondary consumers. So these are organisms that are eating the primary consumers. These are going to be carnivores, right? Because they are eating another animal. They're not eating those producers. But so they're carnivores that are eating herbivores. Those are our secondary consumers. And then at the top of our food chain, we have our tertiary consumers. And these are going to be our carnivores that are eating other carnivores. Okay. And at the top of the food chain, no matter how many levels you have, those are going to be your apex predators, meaning that nothing is eating those consumers. They are at the top of the food chain. So we have our primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. All of those are heterotrophs. Our primary producers down at the bottom are our autotrophs. The trophic levels that we have in an ecosystem are limited by how much energy is available. We can't have a food chain that goes forever. There are only a certain number of levels that can exist within that food chain. This is because even within one level, we have energy that's being lost because all of the energy that we take into our bodies isn't necessarily then available for the next level above us. And then when we do move from one level to the next, it's not a perfectly efficient movement of energy. So we're losing energy within levels, we're losing energy between levels. So if you take a look at this figure down here, this is measuring all of the energy in the different trophic levels of a food chain. This is measured in joules. It's just a unit of energy. The important thing is that you can see that it's drastically decreasing as we go up the food chain. So even though these primary producers, these plants, have 1 million joules of sunlight that they're taking in, they're only creating 10,000 joules of energy that's available for the next level. So even though our primary consumers take in 10,000 joules, there's only 1,000 joules available for the next level. Okay, so there's only about 10% of energy that's moving up into these higher levels. So up here at our highest level, there's not really enough energy available to move to an even higher level. That's why it stops. There's just not enough energy to keep going into more levels. The problem with food chains is that they are just a bit too simple. Maybe somewhere we have a natural system that is just a food chain, but in general, organisms are feeding on more than one level in a food chain. An organism might be being fed on more than one by more than one organism in that food chain. So these multiple interactions that we have need to be illustrated a little bit differently. So instead of a food chain, oftentimes what's used is a food web. This is going to be a bit more accurate when it comes to looking at trophic interactions in natural systems. So this is what our food web looks like. It's similar in the sense that we still have arrows moving from one thing to another, so we can see what direction that energy is transferring from our producers down here, our grasses, into our herbivores, this next level, and then we can see what's feeding on our herbivores as well. And then this food web also has an extra level down here with our detritivores, our decomposers. So you can see that everything in the food web has a brown arrow going down to our decomposers. So our decomposers are very important to keep this cyclical aspect of the trophic interactions going, to return nutrients to the plants so that the plants can keep growing. So not all food webs have this level down here, but this one does, this decomposer level, these detritivores. So not only are food webs illustrating the direction in which energy is moving, they can also show how efficiently this energy is being used and how much remains for other members of the food web. So we kind of saw this in that illustration with our food chain and the amount of energy measured in joules. So we can do the same thing with a food web. We can have the number of joules that are available at that level in the food web. But in order to understand this, we kind of have to understand how much energy is initially available and how much is available for those future levels, how that's measured. So that's what we're going to talk about now. A couple of terms you need to know here. So gross primary production versus net primary production. So when we think about gross primary production, this is going to be how much glucose that our producers, our plants, our photosynthesizers are able to make from the energy source that they use. So if it's our photosynthesizers, they're using light. Maybe we have a type of ecosystem where it's dependent on chemotrophs, where chemoautotrophs, where they're using the energy stored in chemical bonds. But typically we're talking about photosynthesizers here. So they get all of this light in. How much glucose are they actually able to make? So the glucose produced during photosynthesis is our gross primary production. Our net primary production is going to be all of the energy that's left over after respiration. So plants are photosynthesizing, they're also respiring, right? They're doing these cellular processes inside their cells. to feed their own cells. So some glucose is going to be driving these cellular processes and respiration. Everything else is available to lay down new material, new biomass. That's what's left over after respiration. And this is what is available for the next trophic level. Our herbivores that are eating the plants aren't eating every single glucose molecule that's produced by the plant, because the plant is using some of them. They're only eating the glucose that's being laid down as new material. So you can see we have a simple equation over here. Our net primary production is equal to our gross primary production minus respiration. We can carry this thought up to higher trophic levels if we think about secondary production. Secondary production is the amount of chemical energy in the consumer's food that's converted to their biomass and what is available for the next trophic level. So we have a caterpillar here that's eating a leaf. He is eating 200 joules of energy from this leaf. Some of it goes to feces and is expelled from the body. Some of it goes to cellular respiration, keeping those cells full of energy. And then some of it is going into growth, into new biomass. And what is laid down as that biomass is available for the next trophic level. So this is similar to what we saw with plants, but here we're thinking about our consumers. Again, the amount of energy that's being taken in by these organisms from the light or from what they're eating is not all available for that next level. Food webs, like most things in the world, can be impacted by human activities. Your book mentions one specifically, that is biomagnification. So we're going to talk about that since your book mentions it specifically. So biomagnification is an increasing concentration of persistent toxic substances in organisms at each successive trophic level. So how, as we move up this food chain, up these higher levels in our food web, the concentration of toxic substances is increased in those higher level organisms. So we have two charts here. This one over here in the blue, this is from your textbook. It's showing the total concentration of PCBs. So this was a compound that was used in coolants back in the 70s, I believe, maybe early 80s. But you can see that down here we have the lower trophic levels with relatively low concentrations of these PCBs. But as organisms ingest these lower trophic levels and we move up this food web, that concentration is increasing. We have the same thing over here with DDT. So a pesticide that was used, I think it was banned in the 70s, so it was used before then. But again, as we're going up this food chain, you can see that this concentration is increasing. It's relatively low in our producers, but as these producers are ingested, as our primary consumers and secondary consumers are ingested, there's a higher and higher concentration at these higher trophic levels. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about chemical cycling. So we talked about how energy moves through ecosystems. Now we're going to talk about how certain inorganic substances move within the ecosystem. So these are going to include living organisms interacting with their non-living environment. Collectively, these chemical cycles are referred to as biogeochemical cycles, which kind of makes sense because they're incorporating a lot of things. They're incorporating biological aspects of the ecosystem, geological aspects of the ecosystem with things like rocks, and then chemical aspects of the ecosystems, because these are molecules that we're following in these cycles. The first one we're going to talk about is the water cycle. These are all images that are directly from your textbook. So make sure you take a look there at the descriptions they give in the textbook as well. It's a pretty complicated cycle, but we're just going to hit on a few different things. The water cycle in general is obviously very important because we are composed of a lot of water. Most animals need water to survive, and the earth is covered in water. Most of that water, I think about 97 or 98% of it is salt water. And then less than 1% of that remaining water is fresh water in rivers and lakes and streams. Other water is locked up in ice caps or glaciers, or maybe it's in groundwater supplies. So it's a very, very small percentage of water that's available as fresh water. So it's important to understand this cycling. The water cycle is driven by energy from the sun. So energy from the sun comes down. This leads to evaporation over here, and then sublimation as well. Evaporation and sublimation are very similar. They're both processes that lead to the creation of water vapor. In evaporation, we have liquid water that is being converted into water vapor. And then in sublimation, we have ice that is being converted into water vapor. So this is moving water from the earth into the atmosphere. So we have movement of water in that direction. Once water vapor is in the atmosphere, it condenses into clouds. So we have condensation happening. And then this will eventually lead to precipitation. Okay? Precipitation as ice or rain or snow. So this is the return of water from the atmosphere down to the Earth's surface. So we had movement of water into the atmosphere. Now we have movement of water out of the atmosphere. Once this precipitation happens, it might evaporate again, whether that's off of the surface of the Earth or maybe off of some sort of vegetation. It might flow over the surface. Maybe when it rains, this water is going to flow maybe into a stream or a lake that might eventually lead into the ocean. So it could flow into other water bodies. It might also go into the ground, maybe into a groundwater supply, maybe into the soil to be taken up by plants. So there's lots of options for this precipitation to happen. So that's in general what's happening here. There's a few other words that this diagram includes, but those are the major processes that's happening. The next cycle that we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. So carbon is important. It's present in all the organic molecules that we've talked about. These are our energy-containing compounds. So things like fossil fuels are carbon stores that we're using as fuel. So carbon is very, very important. Within biological systems, we do have a biological carbon cycle of photosynthesis and respiration, right? Plants are taking up carbon dioxide. We're releasing carbon dioxide. This counterbalance of photosynthesis and respiration is happening within biological cycles. When we think about the bigger picture, including these abiotic factors, we have lots of carbon dioxide stored in the atmosphere. This carbon dioxide stored in the atmosphere is where plants can get carbon dioxide. It's where we are putting our carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can also be exchanged with water bodies, with oceans and lakes, diffusing into that water so we can have marine photosynthesis and respiration happening in our oceans. In addition to storing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's also a store of carbon dioxide in the ground. This is stored in the soil from decomposition of our living organisms. It could also be from the weathering of rocks. So that's how we're getting carbon into the soil. The next two cycles we're going to talk about are fairly similar in the sense that they are both compounds that are very essential to living systems, but are sometimes a little tricky to get. So the nitrogen cycle we're going to talk about first. Nitrogen is readily available in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas, but it is extremely tricky to get nitrogen gas into a usable form for living systems. So the only thing that can bring atmospheric nitrogen into biotic systems is bacteria. Bacteria do this through a process called nitrogen fixation. Once it's in that usable form, it can be used in living systems. It's very important for photosynthesis, and it can be cycled around these living systems. Nitrogen, when we think about photosynthesis, can be what's called a limiting resource. So a limiting resource is something that you only can do as much of this process as you can because of this one resource, right? So if I have lots of ingredients for sandwiches, if I have lots of meats, lots of cheeses, lots of vegetables, lots of condiments, but I only have 2 pieces of bread, that bread is my limiting resource because I can, no matter how much I have of all of my sandwich fillings, I can only make 1 sandwich if I have 2 pieces of bread. Okay, so that's our limiting resource. So nitrogen can be that for photosynthesis. I can only photosynthesize so much because I only have so much nitrogen. And once it has been cycled around these living systems, the only way to get it back into the atmosphere is also through bacteria by a process called denitrification. So entering and exiting these living systems through bacteria. There's lots of steps involved in the nitrogen cycle as far as what it's doing in living systems. I don't think that's important for us to know for this class. I think what's important for us to know is that it's coming into living systems and leaving systems through bacteria. Okay. And then the last cycle we want to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. This is a very essential part of living systems. We've talked about phosphorus in regards to nucleic acids and genetic material, that sugar phosphate backbone. And then we've also talked about phospholipids, that phospholipid bilayer that the cell membranes have. So these resources are super essential, can also be considered a limiting resource, just like nitrogen was for photosynthesis. Phosphorus is released into the environment through the weathering of rocks that can make it available for our terrestrial food webs. And then in our oceans, primarily where we're getting this is through runoff through rivers flowing into our oceans. We're getting that phosphorus brought into our marine food web so we can use it there. And then one thing that I didn't mention for our nitrogen cycle, but is important for both our nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, is that a lot of the nitrogen and phosphorus entering these cycles are from fertilizers. Fertilizers have a lot of phosphorus and a lot of nitrogen. So sometimes we can get excess phosphorus and nitrogen put into these systems. The sulfur cycle is, I think, in your book, but we're not actually going to talk about it. So don't worry about the sulfur cycle. So when we think about human activities, we've talked about human activities a lot, but they can impact biogeochemical cycles. Primarily the way that they're doing this is by removing nutrients from one location and putting them into a different location. So if we think about the water cycle, and keep in mind that these human impacts that we're talking about on these next few slides, this is not an all-inclusive list of human impacts. This is just a few examples. But when we think about the water cycle, one example of a human impact would be the destruction of our tropical rainforests. So when we cut down all of these trees in our tropical rainforest, this is changing how much water vapor is in the air. And when we're altering the amount of water vapor in the air, that can actually affect not only local weather patterns, but even global weather patterns. So wide-reaching effects of cutting down trees in the rainforest. If we think about crop irrigation, that's another impact on the water cycle. We're pumping large amounts of water into these areas from other areas. So again, that movement from one area to another is a big human impact. Impacts on the carbon cycle, probably the most obvious one of these is going to be the increased burning of fossil fuels. This is what is increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and is leading to some pretty significant environmental problems that you probably hear a lot of people talk about if you listen to the news. This is things like global climate change. If you look down at this figure down here, this is just measuring the atmospheric carbon dioxide in one specific area. You can see that it was kind of constant for many, many years, and then we hit the Industrial Revolution and it just skyrocketed. So that burning of fossil fuels has really, really increased that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then the last one we're going to talk about, I touched briefly on this when we looked at the big cycles, but this is human impacts on nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, primarily going to be the addition of large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus from sewage treatment facilities and the use of fertilizers. When these nutrients get into our aquatic systems, it can cause really, really heavy algae growth. When we have that heavy algae growth, it can pull oxygen out of the water and kill other organisms. This is a process called eutrophication. And when we have this eutrophication, we can have the creation of dead zones where nothing else can survive. So if you look down here, this map of the Gulf of Mexico, we have one in the winter and one in the summer. This red area that is really prevalent in the summer is the dead zone that has been created by these heavy algal blooms. So the creation of dead zones through eutrophication, that is the result of this addition of nitrogen and phosphorus. So that's all we have for chapter 20. Again, that is the last chapter of new material that we're going to have over the course of the semester. Just make sure that you are getting that research paper written and are making sure to submit these final few assignments so we can wrap up this semester.